On a cold February night in 2025, inside a small room in Huntsville, Texas, a man took his last breath. His name was Richard Tabler. He was 46 years old. The state had just executed him by lethal injection. But this story doesn't start there. It starts 21 years earlier, in a place where nobody expected such horror to unfold. If you want to hear more shocking true crime stories like this, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about this case. Your support keeps these stories coming. The year was 2004. Corpus Christi, Texas was a quiet coastal city where people knew their neighbors and felt safe. But safety is sometimes just an illusion. And for two young women, that illusion was about to shatter in the worst way possible. Richard Tabler wasn't always a killer. He grew up like many other kids in Texas. He had a family. He had a childhood. But somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong inside his mind. People who knew him said he was different. He acted strange sometimes. He said things that didn't make sense. But nobody knew just how dangerous he would become. In April 2004, Richard met a man named Timothy Payne. Timothy was younger, only in his 20s. The two of them started spending time together. What they talked about, what they planned, nobody knows for sure. But what happened next would haunt Corpus Christi forever. On April 6, 2004, a Tuesday evening, two women were going about their normal lives. Their names were Tiffany Dotson and Amanda Benefield. Tiffany was just 20 years old. Amanda was 19. They were both so young, with their whole lives ahead of them. They had dreams. They had families who loved them. They had no idea that this would be their last day on Earth. Richard and Timothy were out that night too. They were looking for something. Or rather, someone. The details of how they found Tiffany and Amanda remain unclear, buried in police reports and court documents. But what is clear is this. The two men approached the two women. And what happened next was pure evil. The women were taken, against their will, forced into a situation they couldn't escape. Imagine the fear. Imagine knowing that something terrible is about to happen and being completely powerless to stop it. That's what Tiffany and Amanda faced that night. Richard and Timothy didn't just want to rob them. They didn't just want to scare them. They wanted something much darker. The two women were sexually assaulted. The horror they experienced in those moments is something no human being should ever endure. But their nightmare wasn't over yet. In fact, the worst was still to come. After the assault, Richard and Timothy had a choice. They could let the women go. They could flee and hope to never get caught. But they didn't choose that path. Instead, they chose murder. Both Tiffany and Amanda were killed that night. Shot dead. Their young lives ended in violence and terror. Two families would never see their daughters again. Two futures were erased in an instant. And two murderers thought they could get away with it. But the story gets even darker. Because Richard Tabler wasn't finished killing. Just 3 days later, on April 9, 2004, Richard committed another crime. This time, his victims were two young men. Their names were Shane Harrison and Daryl Powell. Shane was 25 years old. Daryl was just 23. Like Tiffany and Amanda, they were living normal lives, unaware that death was coming for them. The details of what happened to Shane and Daryl are similar to the first murders. Richard approached them. There was violence. There was robbery. And then there were gunshots. 2 more bodies. 2 more families destroyed. 4 murders in less than a week. A killing spree that shocked everyone who heard about it. But here's the strange part. Despite having an accomplice in the first murders, Richard committed the second set of killings alone. Timothy Payne wasn't with him when Shane and Daryl died. Why? What happened between April 6th and April 9th that made Richard go out and kill again, this time by himself? That question would puzzle investigators and lawyers for years. The police worked fast. Bodies were being found. Families were reporting their loved ones missing. The city was terrified. Who was doing this? Would they kill again? The pressure was on to catch the killer before more blood was spilled. Timothy Payne made a deal with prosecutors. He agreed to testify against Richard in exchange for a lighter sentence. Instead of death, Timothy would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, but he would die of old age, not by execution. Richard Tabler, however, would get no such deal. He went to trial. The prosecution laid out the evidence. They showed the jury what Richard had done to 4 innocent people. The jury listened. They deliberated. And then they came back with their verdict, guilty on all counts. And their sentence, death. Richard was sent to death row in Huntsville, Texas. He would spend the next 21 years waiting to die. But his story didn't end there. In fact, some of the strangest parts were still to come. Because Richard Tabler had secrets. And from inside his prison cell, he would do something that nobody expected, something that would make headlines across the entire state of Texas. Death row is supposed to be the most secure place in the entire prison system. Inmates are watched every hour of every day. They have almost no contact with the outside world. They can't hurt anyone anymore. That's what everyone believed. But in 2008, for years after Richard Tabler arrived on death row, something happened that proved everyone wrong. It started with a phone call. But not just any phone call. A death threat. And it wasn't coming from outside the prison. It was coming from inside. From death row itself. From Richard Tabler's cell. The target of this threat was a powerful man named John Whitmire. He was a Texas state senator. He'd been in politics for decades. He was one of the people who made decisions about prisons and punishment in Texas. And somehow, Richard Tabler had gotten his hands on a cell phone and was using it to threaten his life. How does a man on death row get a cell phone? That's the question that shocked everyone. These inmates are searched constantly. Their cells are inspected. Every item they have is monitored. Guards are everywhere. Yet Richard had managed to smuggle in not just one phone, but he'd been using it to communicate with the outside world. And nobody knew for how long. When Senator Whitmire received the threatening calls, he immediately contacted prison officials. An investigation began, and what they found was disturbing. Richard wasn't the only one. Several inmates on death row had cell phones. They'd been calling people, making threats, maybe even planning crimes from behind bars. The whole system had failed. The prison went into immediate lockdown. Every cell was searched top to bottom. Guards were questioned. New security measures were put in place. The scandal made news across Texas. People were angry. If death row inmates could get phones, what else could they get? How safe was anyone if the most dangerous criminals in the state could still reach out and touch the outside world? Richard lost his phone privileges, of course, but the damage was done. He'd shown just how bold he was. Even facing execution, even locked in a tiny cell 23 hours a day, he still found ways to cause trouble. It revealed something important about who Richard Tabler really was. He wasn't afraid. He didn't feel remorse. He was still dangerous, even in chains. But while Richard was making headlines for his cell phone scandal, his lawyers were working hard on something else entirely. They were fighting to save his life. And their argument was surprising. They claimed that Richard Tabler wasn't fully responsible for what he'd done. Because, they said, he was mentally ill. If you're finding this case as fascinating as we are, don't forget to leave a comment below with your thoughts. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in this twisted story. The defense team brought in doctors, psychiatrists, brain specialists. They examined Richard. They talked to him for hours. They looked at his medical history, his family background, his behavior over the years. And they came to a conclusion. Richard Tabler suffered from serious mental illness. Specifically, they diagnosed him with bipolar disorder and possibly other conditions that affected his thinking. Bipolar disorder is a real illness. It makes people's moods swing wildly. One day they might feel on top of the world, full of energy, making reckless decisions. The next day they might crash into deep depression. Their brains don't work the way healthy brains do. And when it's severe, when it's untreated, it can make people do terrible things. The lawyers argued that Richard's mental illness meant he didn't fully understand what he was doing when he killed those 4 people. They said he couldn't control his impulses. They said executing someone who was mentally ill was cruel and unusual punishment, which is forbidden by the Constitution. The American Civil Liberties Union, known as the ACLU, got involved. They're a powerful organization that fights for people's rights, even when those people have done horrible things. The ACLU argued that Texas was about to execute a sick man. They said Richard needed treatment, not death. They filed appeals. They went to court after court, trying to stop the execution. But the state of Texas disagreed. Their doctors examined Richard too, and they came to a different conclusion. Yes, Richard might have some mental health issues, but he knew right from wrong. He knew what he was doing when he killed Tiffany, Amanda, Shane, and Daryl. He planned those murders. He tried to hide the evidence. He ran from police. Those aren't the actions of someone who doesn't understand reality. The courts listened to both sides. Year after year, appeal after appeal, Richard's lawyers fought. And year after year, the courts denied those appeals. The execution date kept getting set, then postponed, then set again. Richard sat in his cell, waiting, while lawyers argued about whether his brain worked well enough to justify killing him. Meanwhile, the families of his victims were still suffering. 21 years is a long time to wait for justice. Tiffany's mother had to wake up every day knowing her daughter was gone. Amanda's family had to live with the images of what happened to her. Shane's loved ones couldn't forget. Daryl's family couldn't move on. They wanted closure. They wanted Richard to finally face the ultimate punishment for what he'd done. Some of them spoke to reporters over the years. They said they didn't care if Richard was mentally ill. He'd destroyed their families. He'd taken 4 lives without mercy. Why should he receive mercy now? The legal system, they argued, had given Richard 21 years of appeals. 21 years of chances to prove he shouldn't die. That was 21 more years than he'd given their loved ones. But Richard's supporters, including some religious groups and anti-death penalty activists, argued that executing him wouldn't bring those 4 people back. It would just create one more death. They said the system was broken. They said mental illness should matter. They said there had to be a better way. The debate raged on. In courtrooms, in newspapers, on television, everyone had an opinion about whether Richard Tabler should live or die. But ultimately, the decision wasn't up to public opinion. It was up to the courts, and the courts had made their choice. In early 2025, the final appeals were exhausted. Every legal option had been tried and failed. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case. The governor of Texas declined to grant clemency. After 21 years on death row, Richard Tabler's time had run out. The execution was scheduled for February 13, 2025, just over 3 weeks from now. As you're watching this video, Richard Tabler is already gone. But in those final days before his death, something unexpected happened. Richard decided to speak, and what he said would leave everyone with more questions than answers. The days before an execution are strange. Time moves differently when you know exactly when you're going to die. Richard Tabler had known this date was coming for months. February 13, 2025, the day marked on the calendar, the day everything would end. Prison officials have a routine for executions. The condemned inmate gets to choose a last meal. They can have visitors, usually family members or spiritual advisors. They can make phone calls. They can write letters. It's a small bit of humanity given to someone who showed no humanity to their victims. But it's part of the process. Richard's lawyers made one final push. They filed emergency appeals right up until the last moment. They argued again about his mental illness. They presented new evidence. They begged the courts to reconsider. But the answer came back the same as always: denied. The execution would proceed as scheduled. On February 13, 2025, Richard woke up knowing he would not see another sunrise. He was moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. The hours ticked by slowly. Guards watched him constantly. He was given his last meal, though reports don't say what he chose to eat. Some inmates pick elaborate feasts. Others can't stomach anything at all. Family members of the victims were notified. They had a choice to make. Did they want to witness the execution? Did they want to watch Richard Tabler take his last breath? Some families always say yes. They need to see it with their own eyes. They need to know it's really over. Others can't bear to watch. They stay home and wait for the phone call telling them it's done. As evening approached, Richard was led into the execution chamber. It's a small room. Clinical. Cold. There's a gurney in the center, like a hospital bed, with straps to hold the inmate down. There are windows where witnesses sit and watch. One window for the victims' families. One for the inmate's family, if they come. One for media witnesses who will report what happens to the public. Richard was strapped to the gurney. IVs were inserted into his arms. These would deliver the drugs that would stop his heart. 3 different chemicals, given in sequence. The first would make him unconscious. The second would paralyze his lungs. The third would stop his heart. If everything went according to plan, it would be over in minutes. But before the drugs were administered, Richard was given a chance to make a final statement. This is tradition in Texas executions. The inmate can say whatever they want. Some apologize to their victims' families. Some proclaim their innocence. Some pray. Some say nothing at all. What would Richard say? The warden asked if he had any last words. And Richard spoke. According to witnesses in the room, his statement was brief. He did not apologize. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not deny what he'd done. Instead, he said something that left everyone puzzled. He mentioned his mental illness. He talked about struggling with voices in his head. And then he was quiet. No apology to Tiffany's family. No words of remorse for Amanda, Shane, or Daryl, just a reference to his own suffering, to his own demons. Even at the very end, Richard Tabler was thinking about himself. The warden gave the signal. The drugs began to flow. Richard's eyes closed. His breathing slowed. And then it stopped. At 6:42 p.m., Richard Tabler was pronounced dead. After 21 years on death row, after killing 4 innocent people, his life was over. The witnesses filed out of the room. Some of the victims' family members were crying. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. It was finally done. Others looked numb, like they couldn't quite believe it was real. The media witnesses rushed to file their reports. Within minutes, news outlets across Texas were announcing that Richard Tabler had been executed. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because while Richard was dead, the questions about his case weren't. People started debating almost immediately. Was justice served? Or did Texas just execute a mentally ill man who needed help, not death? The ACLU released a statement condemning the execution. They said Richard's mental illness should have spared him. They said the justice system had failed. They promised to keep fighting against the death penalty in cases involving mental illness. But prosecutors and victims' advocates had a different view. They pointed out that Richard had been evaluated by multiple doctors. Most agreed he understood right from wrong. He'd planned his crimes. He'd tried to escape justice. His mental illness, they argued, didn't make him less guilty. It didn't bring back the 4 people he'd murdered. And then there's Timothy Payne. Remember him? Richard's accomplice in the murders of Tiffany and Amanda. He's still alive today, sitting in prison, serving life without parole. He'll never get out, but he'll never be executed either. Because he made a deal. He testified. He cooperated. Some people think that's unfair. Timothy participated in the same crimes Richard did. He sexually assaulted those women. He was there when they were killed. Why should he live while Richard dies? The answer is complicated. The law allows prosecutors to make deals. Timothy's testimony helped convict Richard. The system sees cooperation as valuable, even from killers. Others argue Timothy got what he deserved. Life in prison is no picnic. He'll spend 60, maybe 70 years behind bars if he lives that long. Never seeing the outside world again. Never having freedom. Dying alone in a cell. Maybe that's a worse punishment than a quick death by lethal injection. But what about the bigger questions? What about mental illness and the death penalty? Richard's case isn't unique. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of inmates on death rows across America who have serious mental health problems. Should they be executed? Can they be executed? The law says if you understand what you did and understand your punishment, then mental illness alone won't save you. But is that the right standard? Some countries have abolished the death penalty entirely. They say it's barbaric. They say it doesn't deter crime. They say innocent people sometimes get executed by mistake. Other countries, including the United States, believe some crimes are so terrible that death is the only appropriate punishment. Texas has executed more people than any other state in America. Hundreds of inmates since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The state believes strongly in capital punishment. If you commit certain crimes in Texas, you know death might be waiting for you. Richard Tabler knew that. When he killed 4 people in 1 week back in 2004, he knew Texas had the death penalty. He knew what could happen. Whether his mental illness affected his thinking at that moment, we'll never fully know. The doctors disagreed. The courts ruled against him. And now he's gone. What we do know for certain is that 4 families will never be whole again. Tiffany Dotson would be 41 years old today if she'd lived. Amanda Benefield would be 40. Shane Harrison would be 46. Daryl Powell would be 44. They'd have careers, maybe families of their own, children, grandchildren someday. All of that was stolen from them in April 2004. And now, in February 2025, their killer has paid the price the state of Texas demanded. But has anything really been solved? Has anything been made better? Or have we just added one more body to the pile? These are questions that don't have easy answers. When an execution happens, most people move on quickly. The news cycle shifts to the next story. The headlines fade. But for the people involved, the impact lasts forever. Let's talk about what happened after Richard Tabler's execution and what his case teaches us about crime, punishment, and justice in America. The families of the victims gave statements to the press in the days following the execution. Some said they felt relief. Others said they felt empty. One family member said something that stuck with reporters. "We thought this would bring closure, but it doesn't. Our loved ones are still gone. Nothing can bring them back. That's the hard truth about the death penalty. It doesn't undo the crime. Tiffany, Amanda, Shane, and Daryl are still dead. Their futures are still erased. The pain their families feel doesn't disappear just because the person who caused it is gone. Execution isn't a magic cure for grief. But supporters of the death penalty argue that's not the point. The point, they say, is justice. It's about making sure that someone who takes a life must give up their own life in return. It's about showing that society won't tolerate certain crimes. It's about giving families a sense that the scales have been balanced, even if the pain never goes away. Richard's case also raises important questions about mental illness in the criminal justice system. His lawyers presented evidence that he suffered from bipolar disorder and possibly other conditions. But the courts decided that his illness wasn't severe enough to spare him from execution. Where do we draw that line? There are cases where mental illness is so severe that the person genuinely doesn't understand reality. They might hear voices telling them to commit crimes. They might believe they're acting in self-defense against imaginary threats. They might not even remember what they did. Most people agree that executing someone in that condition is wrong. But Richard wasn't in that category, according to the courts. He planned his crimes. He knew killing was wrong. He tried to avoid getting caught. Those actions show a functioning understanding of right and wrong, even if his brain chemistry was abnormal. The legal system makes a distinction between being mentally ill and being so mentally ill that you can't be held responsible for your actions. Still, advocacy groups like the ACLU argue that any serious mental illness should be considered. They point out that mental health treatment in prisons is often inadequate. They say people like Richard might have never committed their crimes if they'd received proper medication and therapy earlier in life. They ask, is it right to execute someone for being sick? It's a debate that will continue long after Richard Tabler is forgotten. And it's not just a philosophical debate. There are real people sitting on death row right now with mental health diagnoses. Their cases are working through the courts. Their families are fighting for them. And victims' families are watching, waiting for justice. Then there's the question of Timothy Payne. He's still in prison as of this video. He participated in 2 of the 4 murders Richard committed. He sexually assaulted those women alongside Richard. Yet he's alive, and Richard is dead. Is that fair? The difference, legally, is cooperation. Timothy made a deal. He testified against Richard. He helped prosecutors get a conviction. The justice system values that cooperation. It gives prosecutors powerful tools to use against the most culpable defendants. Without deals like this, many cases would be harder to prove in court. But morally, that's harder to answer. Some victims' families were okay with Timothy's deal because it helped convict Richard. Others felt betrayed, like Timothy got away with murder. There's no perfect answer. The legal system does its best to balance competing interests, but someone always feels like justice wasn't fully served. What about the 2 murders Richard committed alone? Shane Harrison and Daryl Powell died 3 days after the first 2 victims. Richard killed them by himself, without Timothy's help. Why did he do it? What was going through his mind? We'll never know for sure now. Richard took those answers to his grave. Some criminologists who studied the case suggest Richard might have been spiraling. The first murders didn't satisfy whatever dark urge was driving him. Or maybe he needed money and was willing to kill to get it. Or maybe his mental illness was causing him to lose touch with reality more and more each day. Without a full psychiatric evaluation that Richard was willing to participate in honestly, we can only guess. What we can learn from this case is that violence often escalates. Richard didn't start as a murderer. There were probably warning signs earlier in his life. Smaller crimes, troubling behavior, untreated mental health symptoms. If someone had intervened earlier, if the system had caught him before April 2004, people might still be alive today. That's not to excuse what Richard did. He made choices. Even with mental illness, even with a troubled background, he chose to hurt people. He chose to kill. He had opportunities to stop and didn't take them. Personal responsibility still matters. But prevention also matters. We need better mental health services in our communities. We need to take warning signs seriously. We need to help troubled people before they become violent people. That won't solve every problem, but it might save some lives. As for the death penalty itself, Richard Tabler's execution won't settle that debate. Texas will continue executing people. Other states will continue their own policies, some with the death penalty, some without. The arguments will rage on. Some people will always believe certain crimes deserve death. Others will always believe the state shouldn't kill anyone, ever. What happened in that execution chamber on February 13th, 2025, was the final chapter of Richard Tabler's life. But it wasn't the final chapter for the families he destroyed. They're still living with the consequences of what he did 21 years ago. They'll carry that pain until the day they die. Before we end this documentary, let's remember the victims. Not just as names in a crime story, but as real people who had real lives. Tiffany Dotson was 20 years old. She had friends who loved her. She had dreams for her future. All of that was taken away in one night of horror. Amanda Benefield was 19, barely an adult. Her whole life stretched out before her. She never got to live it. Shane Harrison was 25, young, but building a life for himself. He never got the chance to see where that life would lead. Daryl Powell was 23, full of potential, gone too soon, in a senseless act of violence. These 4 people matter. Their stories matter. And while Richard Tabler's execution might be seen as justice by some, what really matters is that we remember the people he took from this world. We honor them by telling their stories. We honor them by learning from this tragedy. We honor them by trying to prevent future tragedies. If this story affected you, if it made you think, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. And if you want to see more deep dives into true crime cases, subscribe to this channel. We'll keep telling these important stories, giving voices to victims, and exploring the complex questions of justice, punishment, and what we owe to each other as a society. Richard Tabler is gone, but the questions his case raises will remain. And the memories of Tiffany, Amanda, Shane, and Daryl will live on in the hearts of those who love them. That's where the story ends. Not with an execution, but with remembrance.